Hello there, painting students. So this video is primarily just going to show you all, in case you don't already know, how to create a grid on your reference image that you have selected for your animal painting. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen with you so that you guys can see the reference images and see how to make the grid, not just hear about it. So now I'm going to go ahead and pull up my reference images here. That's the video, that's not what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my reference images here, and you will see that I've got all of my images on the left-hand side, just like from the previous video where they've been cropped or they've been altered a little bit based on how I would like to portray those animals. And then remember, your next step is to do sketches, because you want to use your sketching method and your sketching process to help figure out exactly which one animal you want to grid and do on a larger painting, which will be 12 by 18. And we have watercolor paper and acrylic paper in the classroom. If you are working virtually and or in overflow, if you want to try to figure out how to get some of that paper, we can definitely figure that out. Or you can use something that you have smaller and more available to you. So as you can see, I've got all of my reference images here. I'm going to scroll down because the one that I'm going to use is the rooster. So I've already got my grid on there from when I was doing some sketching, but what I'm going to do is go ahead and delete that grid. Not the rooster. Delete the grid. There we go. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and insert that grid, basically the same one, so that I can then grid my paper to match the computer grid so that I can draw the image. So basically you are going to go to Insert, Table, and I have found that going 6 across and 8 down with this particular image works well. The exact number of squares that you have in your grid will be dictated and determined by the reference image that you are working on. So if you have a larger image, you're going to have smaller squares because you want to get all of that detail in there. So it really just depends. So I'm going to go ahead and just use my arrows to make this large enough to fill the space here. Drop that down. Bring it in because right now they're quite rectangular. And we want to make sure that we are using a square as much as possible. I have found that the best way to make it square is to eyeball. Because if you measure it, a lot of times the measurements don't quite line up to make it square. So the best thing to do is just determine when it is square. And then I change the color of my grid and I make it a little bit thicker so it's easier for me to see. So now I've got that image gridded and ready to go. So then the next thing I would be doing, like you see in the next video, is making that same grid on my paper, but larger. So for instance, these squares are quite teeny tiny. On my paper, I used 2-inch squares. So that I'm using the bulk of the paper so that basically my paper is the grid that you have here. It's just much larger. So this is a method of enlarging something from a small reference image to a much bigger final painting. So what I'm going to do right now is just take that grid away so that I can make it go back to the grid that I've already started the drawing based on, because it's important to make sure that I have the grid the same throughout the entire project, because otherwise my image is going to be a little bit off. So that's my original grid. And what I'm going to do is just show you one more grid on this image because it's going to be a slightly different grid. So again, go to Insert, Table, and this time I'm going to be going over probably 8 and maybe even down 8. So 8 rows, 8 columns because it's a relatively square image. Go ahead and stretch it out so that it covers the entire image. And now in a case like this, where I've got the height of the squares pretty good, but I don't want to make them taller and I really can't, the best thing to do is to add another column. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and click. I'm going to go to Format. Normally it's under Format. Table. Okay. So right now I must have something clicked wrong. So click in one of the squares, Format, Table, and then insert a column. It doesn't matter which side. But now you can see that's already a little bit more square. So now what I'm going to do is just make that a little bit smaller here, which then is going to make it even more square. And then if I need to, I can actually make it a little taller. Because essentially the main thing is that you want it to be square. So at this point it's pretty close, it's still a little bit off. So what I could do is undo what I just did. And I can actually go in here and I can add another column and see if that makes it more square. And that by itself makes it a lot more square. So then what I'm going to do is go ahead and change the color. And again, changing the color is a personal choice. You do not have to change the color of your grid. I just find it helps me be a little bit more able to see what I'm drawing. I'm going to change the color. I'm going to make it pink. And then I'm going to also change the border weight to make it a little bit thicker so that it's easier to see. So now I would be going ahead and on my paper, creating a grid that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 across, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 down. And so since our paper is 12 by 18 and we need to go 10 across, then you would have to do maybe a little bit of math and divide 18 by 10 if you want to use that whole space. Or you could use a 10-inch grid. That's just going to be awfully small. So let me grab a calculator really quickly and see what 18 divided by 10 would be. So 18 divided by 10 is 1.8. So basically what I would probably do at this point is make a grid where each square is 1.5 inches. So I would be making my hash marks every 1.5 inches along the top and along the bottom. So that then I still end up with a square grid where each cell is the same size, but instead of being 2 inches like my demo example, it might be 1.5 inches. Because a 1-inch grid is just going to be a little bit too small for the size paper that we are working on. So you want to make sure that whatever scale you use is as large as you can make it for the paper that you have. And obviously that is going to change a little bit from person to person. So we can talk individually about what scale you need to use and exactly how to measure that scale, however much we need to, so that you guys can actually work correctly there. So now I'm just going to give you one more example, just going to do another grid on this image, mostly just so that you guys get used to it. So insert, table, and this one I might just go across 6 and down 8, kind of like I did on my chicken one, but you'll see that it's much smaller this time. Gonna go ahead and cover up my whole image here with the height. Move it over. And when you see that little red plus sign, it just means that the grid is centered on the image, which is perfect. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to go ahead and change the color so that I can see it a little bit better. I'm going to use green this time. Okay, maybe not green because that blends in with the background. We'll stick with the pink. And then when I look at it now, I can see that it needs to be a little bit wider there. So I'm just going to make it a smidge wider so that it's more square. Click off again, look at it. That looks more square. So now I'm just going to make sure that it's still centered. So there's my little red plus. So I know that it's still centered. And then that would be an example that is ready for gridding as well. And I would go ahead and make a grid the same size as I did for the chicken grid, which you guys will see in the next video. And I would go ahead and start into the drawing process. Now, just one thing to remind you about, when you are on the drawing process, I highly recommend clicking present, because what that's going to do is make your image much larger so that it is easier to see. You don't have to necessarily do that, but I do find that it helps just because it's easier to see your image. And then that way your enlargement is not from something super tiny into something much bigger. It's from something moderately small into something bigger. So it's going to be easier to perceive and to get accurately drawn. So once again, that is your gridding step, which comes after you have selected your animals, your reference images, after you have done your sketches to narrow down which one you want to use. And then once you know exactly which one animal you want to use for your painting, that is when you move into the gridding steps, which with this video, and then your next video will show you gridding on paper and the first steps of the drawing process.